You're watching News at Prime. Let's continue with this discussion, but a different one altogether now. And it is the build-up to the announcement of the much-anticipated cabinet of the Government of National Unity. And we are shining the spotlight on some of the important portfolios and what it takes to run such institutions. Tonight, we are focusing the attention on Treasury. And who better to help us discuss this than the former Treasury Director General, Dondo Mogajane. He is in the private sector these days, and alongside him is senior researcher and a fellow at the Trade Collective think tank, Dr. Lebohang Pheko. To both my guests, thank you very much for your time. Welcome. Let's start with you, Mr. Mogajane, in the studio. Yeah. Good to have you with us here. You served as a senior leader at National Treasury. Give us a glimpse of what happens in the period between the term of office of a minister that has just ended his term and the new one that is about to be appointed. I'm asking merely the notion of instability. Do you think it's hyped up by the media at times?
The media hypes it up all the time.
I suspected you'd say
what
that.
One can imagine now, what you have today is a handover report that the Treasury officials would have prepared. And it's there, it's ready, and it's outlining what needs to be done, what is in the pipeline, because that cannot be changed. It's also outlining what are the priorities in the short term and preparations, importance of preparations for October and preparations for the budget, because that process is already almost has started in April.
Yeah. Dr. Pheko, let's bring you into the conversation. So you can already imagine the difficulty I'm faced with here, because he's already dismissed my first question that we are the ones who hype up this notion of instability whenever there's a change of administrations. Do media personnel make a mountain out of a molehill with the changing hands of the administrations? And what kinds of questions should we be asking at a time like this?
It's an interesting question. I think also because in previous administrations, we have had mountains. We had the specter of, at one stage, we had 3 finance ministers over a weekend. So I think in the past, we've also had mountains indeed to deal with. And there's a history, and I think there's a cognitive memory of how destabilizing, how unsettling that was, not only for the markets, but also for the South African imagination, for people in the street as well, for so-called ordinary people. And I think that what the role of the media is to ensure that there's an understanding of how these things actually function, that this is a function of public service and civil service excellence. And at its best, it can work incredibly well. At its worst, of course, we can see the sort of excesses of the 3 ministers over a few days. And in fact, many countries, of course, take their inspiration from the notion of, and I was just listening into your previous conversation, of career civil servants, people like our very good colleague there, Dondo there, who I think epitomize the sort of career leadership, the career civil servant leadership that many African countries and South Africa would learn from, because this takes away the notion that people are being deployed, parachuted in, regardless of their ability and their capacity. And of course, it also, that I think is a much more stabilizing factor than the rumors of mountains and molehills. But also to add that, of course, if you approach this from a perspective of careerism in the context of a GNU, what I'm hoping is that this also means that there's a larger pool of talent potentially to choose from in this grand coalition, GNU, or whatever we're calling it this week, and that perhaps if the ANC is the majority within that GNU coalition has the courage, they might be able or willing to look outside the traditional ranks of the ANC. But that, whether that will be destabilizing or not, is not the point. I think the point is, what is stabilizing is a competent set of hands, wherever that set of hands comes from.
Exactly, and that's the point I want to pick up on, Mr. Mogajane, a competent set of hands. At a time like this, analysts will almost always raise the question of continuity, that safe pair of hands. And so let's talk to your position, your former position of Director General. For people who may not know, what is the role of a Director General, particularly on this spectrum of continuity with the change of hands in administrations?
Look, you have a team of 10 people, DDGs, that reported to me at the Treasury. Competent individuals in their own right, professionals in their own right. And so one knows that when one has to go, or there has to be a new leadership, that you have got a set of people who will take over.
Yeah.
And now, in this context, of course, the country should be comforted, and because you have to rely on those 11 individuals, including the current DG and his team. And of course, a lot of officials who are professionals in their own right, economists, accountants, auditors, etc. So firstly, the comfort is there. Secondly, continuity at the level of the minister is very important. Whenever there were changes, at least I've seen through many changes. I mean, I was the Treasurer for 23 years. I've seen a number of ministers coming in, from Trevor Manuel to Pravin Gordhan to Ndantanene. Clearly, there was some sense of certainty in terms of continuity and where someone comes from. If you look at the current environment, you've got Minister Enoch Godongwana, who has been there as a team finance member from the 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the MEC for finance then, and he constituted a team that was called Team Finance at the time. So look at his performance in the last 2.5 years. Is it something to write home about? Yes. He did well. He's established. He's got a team of people supporting him. So that the market is going to be looking at that. That's why when you read the newspapers today, is that don't tamper with the Treasury.
Yeah.
Don't tamper with... That's why sometimes when there's a lull in the period, especially in the last year when there was no DG appointed, we got a bit worried as to why is there no permanent DG in the Treasury. Finally, the DG was appointed. But I'm saying it's important for a safe pair of hands to continue. And that I can for sure say, when you mess up with that function, clearly it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So don't mess it up.
Dr. Pheko, Dondo Mogajane has just touched on exactly what some people really get upset about, and that is the markets. The markets, it would seem, have been quite receptive of this government of national unity. And I'm not saying this out of my own head. There's been a market rally. The rand has also been on some positive trajectory. Is this a sign that investors approve of this GNU, or is this wishful thinking?
Interesting question, and I think I'm one of the people who is fairly skeptical of the idea that the market is a neutral body or a neutral entity. The market, remember, is a conglomeration of sentiments, and usually sentiments of your Wall Street, your London Stock Exchange, your Hong Kong and Japan markets, the Chinese market. You can throw in Paris, a lot of your ODIs, your OECD countries, for example. And I think that the concern that many people will have with that is that basically means European, Euro-US interests, which seem to be governing or influencing unduly the political decision-making of a sovereign state. And I think that is something that should be concerning. It's important to desegregate the idea that markets are these neutral arbiters who sit in space, and these are real people with real prejudices, predominantly European men sitting somewhere. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the sentiment that says that because the DA is still historically viewed as a white-led and, with a predominantly white constituency, if I may put it as crudely as that, that it is deemed to be safer and is deemed to be more palatable to those very markets, which are essentially, the interests of Euro-US capital. And secondly, this also links to the concerns that many people have had over the years around ratings agencies, and again, these invisible forces that seem to have an overwhelming force and voice in, again, our domestic policy space and our domestic policy and political policy autonomy. And these are the issues which sometimes become conflated, where a lot of these institutions and these so-called markets, ratings agencies, seem to purport to be concerned about policy direction, the rand, when in fact they are concerned more about the politics of those. And I mean, I've been approached by many ratings agencies over the years to give, like many people, like many political economists, to give views around our perspectives. And I found I've exchanged ideas with some of them, and I've exchanged ideas with some of my peers. And we find that there's a lack of interest, and they're quite disingenuous in their real interest in getting to the bottom of things from a policy finance perspective. What they want is the dirt. They want the scandal. They want the riots. They want the shwa-shwi behind the ratings. And I think that that's a really, that lacks integrity. And I think that if we're going to lean on these external bodies and these external interests, we might lose our own way and our own sovereignty. So I do sympathize with the idea that the concerns that many people have around this power of these nameless, faceless market forces.
Very interesting indeed. All right, let's take a break. When we return, we'll close the conversation, but quite interesting indeed so far. You're watching News at Prime, and we are discussing National Treasury. What can be done to strengthen the performance of this important portfolio? Joining me for this conversation still is former Treasury DG Dondo Mogajane and Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective think tank, Dr. Lebohang Pheko. Let's come back to you in studio, Mr. Mogajane. Recently, you wrote in the Business Day newspaper about the partnership between the public and private sectors that is required in order to shape the South African economy for the better. Have we made headway in harnessing this relationship, you think?
We can do more. We have not. We can do more because it's important to ensure that the private sector partners with government. And we've seen that partnership, when it's working in our country, what the results can be. You'll remember that after Minister Nene was fired and the markets were going haywire, 400 billion rand was almost wiped off the JSE. What happened? Government and the private sector came together. If you remember, the CEO initiative at the time was formed. And then we went out jointly into the world. We went out to Boston and New York, we went to London to basically engage bond holders, bond buyers, and say, we are okay. So we've seen that. And we've seen that when government is engaging here, what the market, what the private sector can do.
Yeah.
Look, the jobs are created in the private sector. We have to, as government, on one hand, have to ensure that this, the environment is palatable for private sector to flourish, because that's where the jobs are created. And now, when Oila once spoke about certainty in terms of what needs to happen, the Treasury, of course, plays a major role in ensuring that the markets are calm. As Dr. Pheko was saying, that the markets is some faceless people. But the reality is that you go out there and raise money every day. You go out and raise bonds. Every week, the Treasury has to go into the market and look for 20 plus or so billion rand to finance our daily expenditure. So you can imagine if the market sentiment is views us as negative, our duty is to ensure that we explain ourselves and not be apologetic about some of the things that we have to do as a country, as a collective, as government, as the private sector, and say, as South Africa, we've got certain things that we must address. Yeah. So we shouldn't be afraid to do that, because once we do that, then it's like we're giving into these faceless markets that Dr. Pheko was talking about. But the reality is that we've got challenges as a country. The private sector has to embrace what government has to do. Government must do the same in order for us to flourish as a country. That's the only way. Yeah. Because if we don't, and government is on its own trajectory and the private sector goes the other way, growth is not going to be realized. Jobs are not going to be created. Poverty is going to be what it is. And we're not going to make any inroads in changing the South African story, because clearly we have to really make sure that we change the lives of ordinary people.
Dr. Pheko, we have under 2 minutes left. I'd still like to ask the both of you 2 quick final questions before we end this conversation. So, Mr. Mogajane talks about the challenges that I think we all know face this country. What should be top of mind for this new administration?
I think the top of mind for the new administration is firstly to recover public trust, and I think that will then lead to economic trust, and indeed these markets as well a buoyancy of confidence. But South Africans need to feel confident that our money is being spent wisely, that it's not being either wasted, looted, or disappearing into the ether. Secondly, to ensure that there's much more accountable public service expenditure. So our healthcare, our public education systems. I've always been of the opinion that a healthy nation and an educated nation are very key to building any further economies. The health economy and the social economy lead to every other pathway. And thirdly, I think to ensure that there's a sense of intergenerational change and intergenerational vibrancy in who and what is running the economy. I think we need new ideas. I think we need a cross-platform of ideas across this, as I said, this expanded potential pool of talent and individuals in these 6 parties who are now part of the GNU/coalition. And I think that is going to as well give the impression that this is indeed a coalition of ideas and not a survival exercise of the ANC. And I'll rest it there.
All right. Mr. Mogajane, she's talking about a pool of talent. And it just came to mind that there has been some talk of drawing the finance minister outside of the traditional political environment. And there was a specific name mentioned, Lungisa Fuzile. This is someone you would know. Are you able to put plainly what the thinking behind this is and how it could help the country if we had a finance minister plucked outside of the political establishment?
Look, someone like Lungisa, of course, yes. I mean, he's been there. He was a public servant almost all his life. He's tasted a little bit of the private sector. Certainly will do well. He was my boss the first day I started the Treasury until he left.
And he makes much more money right now.
Yes, but however, all I'm saying is that irrespective of who should be, this should be a coalition of ideas, as Dr. Pheko says, and we mustn't be afraid of this government of national unity with its all ideas. Let's not forget, Xoli, that we had the same. I mean, Peter Miller was the MEC for Finance from INCAT in the late 90s and early 2000s. The Western Cape was under the, at the time they had an MEC for Finance who came from the DP at the time. So, and they were all working within this team finance, as it was called, the Budget Council, and they worked pretty well. So, fine, let's embrace whatever idea. If that's what we're going to get after the president announced, we'll just have to rally around that new Minister of Finance. But if it's someone like Lungisa, who's a safe pair of hands, who's known by the markets, who's known and has got a good track record, let him be. So that's what I'm saying. For me, my choices, if it's Lungisa, it's fine. If Enoch Godongwana continues, I'm fine with it too. I don't have a view in either one of them. But if it was someone else, I would certainly have a view and say, oh no, I'll have some reservations. But the two of them have proven beyond doubt that they did well. Lungisa did well as DG of the Treasury. Enoch Godongwana did well for the past 20 plus years. He's been doing well in this space, in the economic space. Fine, I think for now it's going to have to be, how do we reach out? If it's him, it's going to be how do we reach out to the broader South African populace and say, can we hear good new ideas? Are they there? Maybe they are there. If it's Lungisa, he's tasted the private sector a little bit, he can know one or two things, but look, we'll have to wait for the president. But for me, either one of them I'll be happy with because I've worked closely with them all my public service life.
Unfortunately, time is the enemy here. Dondo Mogajane, I want to thank you very much for your time, former Treasury DG. Dr. Lebohang Pheko, I want to thank you very much for your contributions tonight.